record it, we can decide.
Okay, I'll put it on record.
Okay.
Okay.
Right. Hello, everybody so far. Hopefully we've got some more people coming who've booked, I think, haven't we?
Yes.
Hello?
We have 16, well, 17 including me registered. So at the moment there were 8 up to
Yes.
8, 9, 10. Somebody else is coming in at the moment.
Yes.
11.
There are people who have their spouses, their partners with them. So, you know, 1 registration equals 2.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Hmm.
And we have some people who are outside Leamington, particularly glad to see Miranda Pinch joining us, who of course has been a speaker. Yeah.
And Celia, I think, is in Solihull.
Celia Solihull, yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Clyde is about to join us. Merely Lemteris.
Yeah, the Lillington chapter, present and correct. Yeah.
Yes. So, what time? Pun? Yes, Bernard is here as well, although he's out of the picture. So, as usual, he says. John, good to see you. Right, and David Epstein is here. So we have to decide what time to start, how long to wait to see if people. Should give people another couple of minutes? Or shall we just
if they're anything like me, they'd lost that they couldn't find the email with the link because it got buried by 900 other emails.
Yeah, we have, I mean, Saul has registered to come.
Yes.
But of course, people, they may register but not come. So we're now up to 12.
Did a reminder go out this afternoon? Yeah.
Belinda sent out a reminder.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm sure it's not a bigger group, Thomas, but there you are.
That's fine. Quality over quantity.
Absolutely. Right. So, do you think we should start? Yes. And if people join, they'll join in as we go along. Let's get started on time. Well, I'll just say welcome, everybody. As you probably all know very well, this is organised by Justice for Palestinians, which is a group, just for those people who were not around at the beginning of the group, was established in January 2009 after the start of Operation Cast Lead, the war on Gaza. And 5 Jewish people, including myself and Bernard, who were signatories and still are signatories of Jews for Justice for Palestinians, got together with a larger group of non-Jewish people to decide what we could do to raise awareness of what was happening in Gaza and in Israel-Palestine. Over the years, as you probably know, we've had public talks, we've had vigils, we've had films, we have our annual MAP, Party for Palestine in Aid of Medical Aid for Palestine, which is also always a good event, but also a very good awareness raising event. And really, as well, one of our main events, sadly not this year, has been our stall at the Leamington Peace Festival, where we get a very good footfall, and it's been very encouraging over the years to see the increasing awareness and interest of people as to what the problems are, and has given us a lot of opportunity to engage in discussion, education and raising awareness. And it's really a shame that that's not happening this year. We have just started, instigated by Belinda when she came back from Palestine, a monthly vigil outside the town hall. It's absolutely simply to protest against the occupation. I think there's not going to be a September one because they were held up in the early days of COVID, but we are going to have the next one on October the 12th, Saturday, October the 12th, 11 to 12 a.m. Is that right?
September.
Well, you told me October. That's
Oh, that was my crap.
All right, September.
Yeah, sorry.
September the 12th, outside the town hall. We have a very good banner which says "End the Occupation." So please do join us if you can. And our next meeting is going to be with the local United Nations Association, who actually regularly have an audience of 50 anyway. And it's going to be an UNRWA speaker from Jerusalem, and we're waiting for a date for that, which we will let people know. So that's the business, really, to say, if you have any questions that you haven't submitted, please submit them on the chat icon below. And Belinda is going to deal with the questions so that I don't mess up the technology. And Marianne is standing by to deal with any Zoom problems. So hopefully we should be okay. So welcome, Tomer. It's good to see you back. We've had some contact with you in the past. Tomer is a local resident. He's studying a PhD in health sciences at Warwick University, and has, I think, been, I don't know if you've been a prime mover, I'm sure you'll tell us, in this new organisation, Amod, which sounds like a very exciting organisation, who just pulled off a wonderful event in London that I'm sure we're going to hear more about. So over to you, Tomer.
Thank you very much. Yeah, very glad to be able to speak to a local group more about the work of Nahmad. I'm going to share my screen because I've put together some slides just so you don't have to stare at my face for so long. Great. So yeah, just to say that, yeah, I have been involved since the early days of Nahmad, and I'm going to talk a bit about how we came to be created and a bit of why we exist and what we've been doing. But just to emphasize that I'm speaking in a personal capacity rather than on behalf of Nahmad, because we're actually quite a diverse organization, and yeah, I'll touch a bit more about that as we go on. Yeah, and I'll try, I'm going to try and speak for about half an hour, and then hopefully we'll have about half an hour of questions, and feel free to ask anything to follow up if I didn't cover something in enough detail at all. So I'm just starting with this because a bit of personal context, because I think for Jews in Israel, the personal is always very political. And so this is a picture of me when I was about, I'm not sure, 5, 6, 7 years old, visiting the Western Wall in Jerusalem, the holiest site for Jews, if you don't know. And so my dad is actually British Israeli, and all of his immediate family live in Israel. So I visited a lot when I was growing up. Like most British Jews have spent time in Israel. And I was raised like a lot of kind of progressive with a small p British Jews to support peace in Israel, and particularly over kind of the last decade or parts of my childhood to oppose the right-wing Israeli government led by Netanyahu. But I was also raised, again, like most British Jews, to unequivocally support Israel's right to exist, to believe that a lot of the kind of narrative around Israel in wider society was false, if not anti-Semitic, and to believe also that kind of the failure to create peace, or the failure to create peace essentially was primarily the responsibility of Palestinians who kind of rejected peace time and time again. That was definitely the view that I was given from all sorts of places, but particularly within the Jewish community, whether that's Jewish societies at university, through synagogues, just through wider Jewish media, and through family and friends as well, inevitably. And actually, just by coincidence, it was around the time that I moved to Leamington about 4 years ago. I spent some time in Israel. In fact, I went on some trips with other young British Jews, and that's the first time I've been to the West Bank, and I saw the occupation firsthand. And it was a real kind of light bulb moment for me, just as it was, I know, for other people as well. So this is a picture of Hebron showing a separation point where Jews and Palestinians are very overtly and physically separated. And that was for me, it's where I started to shift my mindset from seeing the Israel-Palestine situation as I previously saw it very much as a conflict, and then I started to see it more as essentially an oppression, one people oppressing other people. And I was very acutely aware, as someone who'd been raised to have a very strong connection with Israel, and to see it as part of my Jewish identity, essentially, which is what a lot of British Jews feel, and I still feel to some extent, because of that upbringing. I felt very responsible for what was happening. I saw it happening in my name, and I felt that I needed to find an outlet to speak out against that more overtly, or definitely more overtly than I had done before. So I wasn't the only person who felt like this, and there were various other people who were kind of trying to find the right outlet in the British Jewish community to express these views. And there were various different organizations that people did that through, including myself. One is Yachad, which people might have heard of. It's very well known within the British Jewish community, which is a sort of liberal Zionist organization. It tries to mobilize British Jews, or tries to create a space for British Jews in the Jewish community who support two states. Judas, I'm sure lots of people have heard of, because of their event with Jeremy Corbyn a couple of years ago. They're an anti-Zionist voice in the Jewish community, and they're quite radical and kind of disruptive, challenging the views that are held. The Centre for Jewish Nonviolence is a group I was involved with, who I actually spoke to Leamington Justice for Palestinians about a few years ago, who take British Jews from the diaspora over to Israel to undertake anti-occupation activism on the ground with Israeli Jews and with Palestinians. And the New Israel Fund is another organization I was involved with for a while, which raises money for progressive causes in Israel. So this is just a selection of different organizations that people tried to speak out against the status quo through. But there was a sense amongst a lot of us that there wasn't quite the right thing for us in the UK. There wasn't someone who's maybe challenging the norms in the British Jewish community quite as overtly as they needed to be challenged. So a few of us came together and started having conversations about whether there's something we needed to create or some way that we could work together to do more to challenge the status quo. And actually, this was about April 2018. I remember the date actually because it was only a couple of days before that Judas Passover sale that Jeremy Corbyn went to. And so that was the first time we'd all come together in a room to talk about this. And then a few weeks later, after we kind of said, yes, let's do something, but we're not sure what, this happened. It was when the American embassy was moved to Jerusalem from Tel Aviv, and there were protests on the Gaza border, and a lot of Palestinians were killed at the protests. And so there was a big outcry, including within the Jewish community, and there was more outcry than there would normally be about, or more immediate outcry than there would normally be about Israel's actions in Gaza. And so even though we didn't quite know what we wanted to do, this group of us who'd been involved in these different organizations, we felt that we had to respond in some way. So we decided to do this. We came together, we did a call out for people, for British Jews to come together at Parliament Square in London. And we had a kind of a small ceremony, which included saying Kaddish, which is the Jewish prayer of mourning for everyone who'd been killed in the protests. It was basically what had happened in between us deciding to have this public event and it actually happening. Hamas had taken responsibility, or no, they'd said that most of the people who'd been killed were members of Hamas. And so suddenly the narrative was that Israel's actions were totally justified because most of the people who'd been killed were Hamas members. And actually, yeah, so there was a huge backlash essentially to what we'd done. And so this man here in the middle, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but he came and he filmed us, and he brought some people with him who kind of were very abusive towards us at the actual event. This is quite a well-known rabbi in the UK who called us capos, which, if you don't know, they were Jews who who took on leadership roles in concentration camps under the Nazis and kind of helped the Nazis, so they're seen as kind of traitors. And it's a widely used abusive term for Jews who don't stand up for Israel. One of my friends who was involved in organizing it alongside us, or who'd attended, in fact, wasn't that involved in organizing. She was a leader in a Zionist youth movement. There's a lot of Zionist youth movements in the UK, all Jewish youth movements, I should say, are Zionist youth movements. And they all run trips every summer to Israel. She was fired from running one trip. Thankfully, she was hired by another one who had more sensible leadership. She was fired. So it was this huge backlash. And it's something that I think is important to be reflective about. Like, some people were genuinely hurt by the fact that we used the Kaddish as part of this ceremony, because it's a very personal prayer for a lot of people. They say it for, you say it for your immediate family members mostly, especially in more orthodox strains of Judaism. It's not really used outside of your immediate family if they die. And so they felt it was wrong to politicize the prayer in that way, and I'm sympathetic to that. And also, maybe there were people who just saw us as taking as kind of us taking a unilaterally anti-Israel line and not seeing the kind of nuanced perspectives that existed within the people who did turn up on that day. But undoubtedly, a lot of the backlash was about people who just saw us as criticizing Israel and that being unacceptable and trying to push us out of the community. And there were people who just opposed any sort of humanization of Palestinians whatsoever, and wanted to try and stamp that out as quickly as possible and vilify that. And yeah, I think those were kind of the main responses. But actually what the backlash did was it made a lot of people who hadn't even been at the protest kind of say, right, there's something wrong with the community. And actually you can see it slightly in this newspaper front page here. This is the most senior progressive rabbi in the UK. She's saying we're on a path of self-destruction. She's talking about the debate about Israel in the community and the abuse that was directed towards us for having led this protest or this ceremony. And it led a lot of people who hadn't even been at the protest say, okay, we actually want to be a part of challenging this status quo in the Jewish community, the British Jewish community, where if you step beyond the bound, what's seen as a reasonable bound of criticizing Israel, you receive this huge backlash, which we think is wrong. So we came together and we said, okay, we want to found something that's going to exist beyond this, some sort of organization or movement. And this was an op-ed that was written in the liberal Jewish newspaper Haaretz around the time. And it was kind of founded on some core principles. So one is that we are a movement of Jews and a diverse movement of Jews. So we're not specifically progressive Jews. There are Orthodox observant Jews in Nahmad. We are diverse in terms of whether people are secular, whether they aren't secular, whether they have a background like very involved in the Jewish community or whether they don't. We accept, it's not just for Ashkenazi Jews, European Jews, we have Mizrahi, Middle Eastern Jews, we have other Jews of color, we have Black Jews. And so we're a very inclusive movement, but by and large, the people who were involved at the beginning definitely came from kind of institutions of the Jewish community, particularly people who come out of these Jewish movements, the Zionist youth movement. We were very much founded on Jewish principles, and we said that we hold the views that we hold over Israel-Palestine because of our Jewish values, not despite them. And calling on the values that we're taught in our youth movements, things like, or in our synagogues, things like B'Tselem Elohim, which is a really core Jewish value about seeing all people as created in God's image. And also, you know, there are loads of others we can draw on. There's Tzedek Tirdof, which is this value around you shall pursue justice, 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 you shall pursue, it means in Hebrew. And in fact, our name, Na'amad, is taken from the word that's used to call Jews to speak, to read from the Torah in synagogue, but it means we will stand. So it's about taking a stand as well in support of the Palestinian cause. And in support, I mean, we very much frame it as we believe in freedom and equality for all people. So that's what this is saying here, about no one can be free until all people are free. So we want all Israelis and Palestinians to live in freedom, to have equality, and to have justice. And we think that's essential for all people to be free, essentially. And also because there's a lot of diversity in the Jewish community politically as well, we're a very pluralistic movement. So we don't take one position on Zionism, BDS, or borders. We accept a range of views on, we accept people basically whether they're Zionist, whether they're anti-Zionist, non-Zionist, post-Zionist. We have all sorts of identifications. We don't take a position on BDS. Some of our members strongly support it. Some people, for all sorts of reasons, don't, which I can expand on at the end if you want to ask questions about it. And we don't take a position on borders, so we don't say that, you know, we think the right solution is a two-state solution or a one-state solution or a federalist solution. Again, there's a range of views in our movement. We just believe that whatever the solution is, it has to deliver freedom, equality, and justice for Palestinians and Israelis alike. So this is kind of the foundation that we started. But actually, we really wanted to have an impact, and we definitely took learnings from successes and failures of previous organizations in the Jewish community that had tried to speak out about Israel-Palestine, in that we wanted, and also both in the Jewish community in the UK and around the world, and that we needed to know what we were doing and have a kind of purpose. So we did some work with If Not Now, which people might have heard of, which is an American Jewish organization, which was founded in 2014 after the war in Gaza that year. And it's done a lot of activism to change the American Jewish community, and it's had a really transformative impact in the 6 years it's existed. So we spoke a lot to them. They actually really generously sent their leaders out to run some workshops with us and think about the work that we wanted to do. And we actually took off almost an entire year to do this work because we knew it would be really important in the long run if we wanted to have longevity and impact. So we came up with a strategy, which I'm going to talk briefly about now. And again, I can talk a bit more about it at the end if you want to ask more about it. So first we had to think about what is actually our role in ending the occupation as British Jews. And to do this, we thought about, okay, the occupation is a system of oppression, and there's lots of different, to use this analogy, there's lots of different pillars that hold it up. So, for example, one pillar is militarism in Israeli society. That's the first one here. The other is the Israeli government, obviously a very clear role in upholding the occupation. The Israeli economy is very built around the occupation, and so it's economically advantageous at the moment for the occupation to be upheld. Christian Zionists in America, we know in particular, have a huge influence in upholding the occupation. As Trump said a couple of weeks ago, the move of the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem wasn't for Jews at all. Jews actually, for the most part in America, didn't want it. It was Christian Zionists, his base, who wanted that. Racism, of course, is a factor in upholding the occupation. The occupation wouldn't exist if there wasn't racism against Palestinians. But one other pillar, there are loads more, this isn't an exhaustive list, but one other pillar is the Jewish diaspora. And in America, that takes a very material form. There are some American Jewish organizations and individuals who send substantial money over, which literally fund settlements in the West Bank. But also there's another role in that the Israeli government justifies what it's doing. I touched on this before. The Israeli government justifies what it's doing in the occupied territories, because it believes, because it claims that it's for the safety of Jews everywhere. And a lot of Jewish leaders and individuals and organizations around the world in the Jewish diaspora spread that message as well, and it's wrong. So what our role is to transform our own community and challenge those views, and instead of having predominantly pro-occupation voices in our community, to have predominantly anti-occupation ones. And that by doing that, we will help weaken the system of occupation that exists. And we can't bring it down alone, but if enough of these pillars are brought down, it will destabilize the whole system. So we focus very much on transforming our own community, ending its support for the occupation as it currently exists. And there are different ways that we can do that, which some of the organizations I touched on before have taken different approaches. So one is personal transformation, to actually work with individuals to kind of transform their views one by one, to turn them into anti-occupation Jews one by one. Another is to create alternatives. So to say, you know, look at the pro-occupation institutions that exist in our community at the moment, or to say we're going to create alternatives to those, create anti-occupation synagogues, for example, or denominations. And the third approach is to just challenge the institutions that already exist in our community and try to transform them. And to create, this isn't just about the Jewish community, this example of these theories of change, they're for any sort of social change. And you need all three of them to be able to create lasting change. And we saw our gap as challenging dominant institutions. We felt there were other organizations that were doing these to some extent already, but there wasn't a clear enough Jewish voice in the community, from within the Jewish community, that was challenging the way that some of the organizations that claim to represent us, the way that they were essentially supporting the occupation, if words, if not in deeds. And we also thought about how we wanted to change our community and challenge the dominant institutions that exist in them. And traditionally, the view of power that we're ingrained to see in society is a monolithic one, which sees, slightly covered now, sorry, but which sees people at the top of society in positions of power as being the ones who can bring about change. So if you want to bring about change, you would lobby people with power. And actually, we say that we're not going to believe that in our theory of change. We actually don't think it's true. We think that if you want to bring about change, you have to move the people, the masses at the bottom of society, as it were, because the people at the top with positions of power, superficial power, they're granted that power by society as a whole, or by communities as a whole. So if you can change the attitudes of enough people in the community, the people at the top are also forced to change their views, or they lose their legitimacy, or they lose their power. And there's loads of examples of this throughout history. A really good one is around same-sex rights and same-sex marriage, and about how over 20, 30 years, there was a lot of campaigns to kind of normalize attitudes towards gay people in the UK and America, and to try and to kind of make it more acceptable, or make society more accepting of gay people. And because that was successful, that's why eventually political leaders were forced to kind of legalize same-sex marriage, not because they were specifically lobbied on that issue by the right people. It was because society changed that then in turn the people at the top of society changed the laws with them. So sorry, I know I'm doing like a really whistle-stop tour, but yeah, we can delve further in if you have any questions about it. But yeah, we're looking to change our society to challenge the dominant institutions, and vice versa. We're challenging our dominant institutions to change society, or change our community rather, in our case. And about how we do that, all of this learning was taken largely from an organization in America called Momentum, which has absolutely no relationship to the Momentum in the UK and the Labour Party. They've just got the same name. But it's done a lot of thinking about how you actually bring about this sort of change in communities or in wider society. And they worked a lot with If Not Now as well, who passed this on to us. And there's two sort of main activist traditions. One is the structure tradition, which is about creating institutions which act to bring about change. And a really good example is trade unions. Kind of very much they're about organized people. So they kind of work to organize people, and they tend to work on very specific demands. So they might work on raising pay or improving working conditions. And there are community organizations, community organizing organizations like Citizens in the UK who do that. And the kind of the godfather of this work, if you know about this or are interested in this, is a guy called Saul Alinsky, who is a community organizer in Chicago in the 50s, 60s, 70s. So that's kind of one tradition in organizing. And the other one is mass protests, and they tend to be very reactive, like on specific issues, and they tend to have very ambitious goals. So great examples would be, if you've been following the protests happening in Israel right now, like they're very spontaneous, they're very nebulous, they don't have clear organization, but they're quite impactful. That's an example of mass protest. The Iraq War protests are a great example of that from 2003, the Occupy movement after the financial crash. These are all kind of spontaneous eruptions of mass protest, people who turn out on the streets, and then they tend to fizzle out quite quickly. And what this momentum have tried to do is they've tried to find examples from history, for example, Martin Luther King, the Otpor movement in Serbia, which is a bit of a niche example, but overthrew Milosevic, the dictator in Serbia in the 90s, who've kind of blended these models, who've done a combination of organizing people, but then being very reactive at the same time, and kind of having the nimbleness that mass protests have, which often organizations like trade unions struggle to have because they're big organizations, and big organizations struggle to be nimble and reactive. So if not now, definitely adopted this model or this tradition. And it's covered by my screen now, sorry, but another great example who are doing this in the UK at the moment is Extinction Rebellion. They've learned exactly the same stuff. They've learned from Momentum as well. And this was the model that we decided to take. So we wanted to create an organizational movement, but we didn't want it to be very rigid and focused on specific issues. We wanted to embrace any Jews who adopted our values and who opposed the occupation, who could take pretty much any action they wanted to challenge the way our community currently upholds the occupation. And again, if you're involved in Extinction Rebellion, you might have heard these numbers, but actually, in order to bring about the change that we want to bring about, we follow the 3.5% rule, which was established by this researcher called Erica Chenoweth. She's an academic, and she did a lot of research about how campaigns can be successful. And basically, you just need 3.5% of your target population to actually join your movement, who in turn persuade through their actions 50% plus one person of your community or of society to agree that the occupation needs to be opposed. And so they don't need to agree with your movement. In fact, they might really disagree with your movement and think that you're too radical, and that's fine. As long as they agree that the occupation needs to be ended, then that's enough. And we also know, Erica Chenoweth did a lot of research, and she found that the movements that were most successful in doing this employed non-violent direct action as their tactic. So that's what we decided to do after this year of work. And the first thing we came back with was a campaign called The Elephant in the Room. And it was about challenging our community to always talk about the occupation when we talk about Israel, because the occupation is just a massive elephant in the room in the Jewish community when we talk about Israel most of the time. So we do all sorts of things. This was after one of the Israeli elections in September 2019, so almost exactly a year ago. The Board of Deputies of British Jews, who are kind of the main representative organisation for British Jews, they always put out a statement. So on the day of the election, the day of the election results, before they could put out their statement, we turned up to their offices with a giant elephant and with a pre-written statement for them calling out the racism that had been used, that Netanyahu had used in the election, the fact that Palestinians in the occupation hadn't even been considered in it. Unsurprisingly, they didn't decide to use our statement that we generously written for them. But we got some attention in the community for this. We also, there's an organization called Stand With Us, which does a lot of education with young people, which they claim is very neutral. It's not, it's very pro-occupation, it defends the occupation at every opportunity. So we sent people into their conference with elephant masks to disrupt it. So this is how we kind of started getting this conversation going in the Jewish community. Then we really started to get a lot of traction when we did an event, or did a protest outside an event with an Israeli organization called Regavim, who are really, they're a fascist organization, and they use what's called lawfare. So they use the courts in Israel to basically demolish Palestinian villages in West Bank. And I mean, they're essentially facilitating ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. And they're trying, and the consequences of the court cases that they bring are that Palestinian villages are put under threat. The Palestinians often leave to live in towns, and it creates, and often settlers move in afterwards to take over the space. So an organization called UK Lawyers for Israel brought them over to give a talk in the UK, which is, even as I say, I can't believe how disgraceful it is, because they're really such an appalling organization, but we went and protested, blockaded the outside of the entrance to the talk, and held a protest there. And so that was an example of the non-violent direct action that we used to really say that this wasn't okay in our community. And as part of that, again, we kind of used liturgy. So we had the Jewish prayer for the home as part of our ceremony, kind of in tribute to the Palestinians who were losing their homes as a result of Regavim's actions. And we sang in Hebrew, often songs that we'd learned in the Jewish youth movements we were raised in, or in our synagogues. So it was very much about being there as Jews and opposing it as Jews. That was quite a significant action for us. Another significant action was when earlier this year the Israeli government announced that it was going to appoint Tzipi Hotovely as its new ambassador to the UK. I'm sure some of you are aware of Mark Regev, who is the previous ambassador. If you thought he was bad, Tzipi Hotovely is really absolutely appalling. First of all, she was the settlements minister until recently. I think she still technically is for a tiny bit longer, but she's invited really like appallingly racist, on the borderline of being criminal even in Israel, fascist groups into the Israeli parliament, the Knesset. She said that she thinks she opposes Jews and Palestinians having relationships. She's called human rights activists war criminals. I mean, the list is endless. Just, yeah, a really, I mean, ironically, she is very representative of Israel, of the Israeli government today, and portions of Israeli society today. But we called on the UK government to reject her appointment as ambassador, which they have the right to do, and which the Brazilian government did to the Israeli ambassador a few years ago. And we got a lot of traction around this. We got around 1,800 Jews, British Jews, signed our petition on this. And we got some coverage outside of the Jewish community and the Jewish media, which was significant for us. And the other main thing that we've done recently is focusing on annexation when it seemed like that was kind of very imminent and was going to happen when it was first announced. And we launched this campaign, which we've got a video of. I'll skip it for now, and we can go back to it and watch it if there's time, just to make sure. But it's just a kind of summary of our campaign around annexation, which I've also got a summary of here in this image. So basically, we put out 4 demands to our community under the umbrella of saying there are a lot of people who are condemning annexation. And we said, actually, you know, it's important to condemn it, but it's not enough to condemn it. We also need to take material action in our community in response to the Israeli government proposals to annex parts of the West Bank. And these 4 demands were that all Jewish communal organizations that are members of the Zionist Federation, which is most mainstream British Jewish organizations, should suspend their membership until it speaks out against annexation. So the Zionist Federation kind of claims that it represents all strands of Zionism in the UK, but actually it only represents the most right-wing voices, and it was very vocal in support of annexation, even though a lot of its members did actually oppose annexation. Our second demand was for Israel education in the community to address annexation and occupation, rather than just ignoring it like it does and it being an elephant in the room. The first is that all the philanthropy that British Jews send to Israel, which is pretty substantial, needs to go to charities which oppose annexation. And our fourth demand was that we needed to end our community's uncritical relationship with Israeli officials. So no more inviting Israeli officials to gala dinners or to kind of cozy events where they get softball questions, which happened a lot, particularly with Mark Regev, because he loved those sorts of things. And to say that can't happen anymore. You know, we really need to, you know, we understand that for all sorts of reasons, Jewish community organizations might need to meet with the Israeli ambassador, but we can't have these kind of informal events which essentially just normalize the occupation and annexation the Israeli government's doing. And the main action that we did as part of this was in response to the fact that we couldn't do physical actions because of the pandemic, was we went to 3 different buildings. This was in June we did this, I think, July, June or July, and we projected messages onto them. So this one here on the left, this is the Board of Deputies headquarters, and we said, British Jews demand moral leadership. Board of Deputies stand against annexation, because they'd refused to condemn it, even though hundreds of Jews had asked them to. We also went to the Jewish National Fund, which is a Jewish charity, which does a lot of sort of environmental work in, or it's seen as doing environmental work in Israel, and basically it's really common in the Jewish community for houses or for synagogues to have little tins. They're really famous, where you give money to the JNF every Sabbath, because it's on the Sabbath you're supposed to give a small amount of money to charity. But actually the JNF is involved in displacing a Palestinian family in East Jerusalem called the Samaritan family at the moment. They've got their case going to the Supreme Court in Israel, but they've lost every stage so far. Basically, it's this Palestinian family who've had their home for generations, and because of the JNF weaponizing Israeli law, they're trying to kick them out of their family home and replace them with settlers. So again, like very clear ethnic cleansing. And the JNF in the UK, even though they're technically separate from the JNF in Israel, they've refused to condemn what's happening there, and also they've actually been very vocal in support of people like Tzipi Hotovely and the current Israeli government. And so we called on British Jews to stop donating to them. And we also went to the Foreign Office, and we said that our government can't just condemn annexation or say that they support two states in their very milquetoast way, ignoring the reality on the ground, which is the two-state solution is at the very least severely imperiled by annexation and the de facto annexation that's already taken place in the occupation. So we projected 3 messages at each one, so these are 3 of them. And again, this was got a lot of notice both within the Jewish community and without it, and started a really powerful conversation. And motivated a lot of Jews to actually recognize that, yeah, this is something we need to be taking a stand on, and inspired them to join our movement. So what next? We're not sure at this stage. We're still very much focusing on the 4 demands that I said before, and we're talking more about the fact that yes, we're opposed to annexation because de jure annexation, where the Israeli government had legally stolen Palestinian land, would have been terrible for all sorts of reasons. But it's also important to acknowledge that there is already de facto annexation. 53 years of occupation has resulted in what is basically annexation already. So these 4 demands still need to be met by our community. It's not good enough to just assume that because de jure annexation is off the table, we can just go back to ignoring the occupation. You know, we're still grappling with how we do our activism in the era of COVID, especially because there aren't many in-person events in the Jewish community for us to kind of turn up and challenge. But we were really creative with our projection action, and we hope that we're confident that we'll have more creativity and come up with new ideas in the future, and particularly in the coming months as schools go back, as universities go back. There's a really important opportunity to talk about Israel education in our community, and also when Hotoveli arrives, which I think is going to be in a matter of weeks as the new Israeli ambassador. I really want to make sure that it is absolutely beyond the pale for any Jewish communal leaders to meet with her. Yeah, so we'll see what happens around that. So that's me. I'm sorry that was kind of so much packed in very quickly. Stop my screen share now, but hopefully you can kind of keep track of it. It was of interest, but if you'd like me to expand on anything, then yeah, please fire away. I'm happy to do so.
Okay, shall I take over, Sally?
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you. I mean, that was very thought-provoking and very interesting how you thought it out, particularly impressive that you took a year to sit back and think it out. I'm passing over to Belinda now, who's going to deal with the questions.
Okay, thanks very much, Toma. Just to say that there's Namod, I mean, you've been impressive at the sort of the various initiatives you've taken, and like all of us having to deal with COVID. And I'd just like to say how good the webinars have been. And in fact, there was a webinar earlier today on the Israel protest. I watched part of it. It went out also on Facebook and there's a recording there. So I'll circulate that to people tomorrow, because I thought it was very interesting hearing from people in Israel about the protest, and also whether you can then translate this into something. You know, one of the activists was saying, yeah, it's not, you know, it's great that 20,000 people are turning out outside Netanyahu's home, but we need them actually now to turn up in Silwan and to take part in the continuing demonstrations that happen in East Jerusalem and other parts of the West Bank, and in the West Bank. What I think would be very interesting for all of us to hear, and David Epstein has particularly posted some questions on this, is a bit more about how you organise as an organisation. Is there a membership structure? What sort of numbers have you got? You're clearly, whatever your weight is, you're punching above it. I mean, you've said that your objective is to get 3.5% of the Jewish community. How are you getting on with that? And also, I think it's fair to say that you're tapping into a demographic that we can only dream of. So it'd be very interesting for us to hear about what you're doing. Also, perhaps you can then say something, I mean, you've indicated already about future activities, focusing, for example, on the incoming ambassador. We've been enormously impressed about the creativity you've used, and you know, we'd like to stretch our minds to that. But tell us a bit about how the organisation runs and how big you are, how you're growing.
Yeah, so to some extent, it's something we're still kind of figuring out, because we've grown. I mean, we're still not massive numbers. We've probably, so when we started, there were probably somewhere between 25 and 50 people, I would say, who were kind of involved, and people drifted in and out a bit. And then we've, in the kind of year since launching and taking people in, we've definitely well over doubled in size, as we've definitely got well over 100 people. And yeah, so it's still, so we're still kind of figuring out as we grow, because that is, for an organisation our size, that's fairly substantial growth fairly quickly. So we're figuring out how to organise, but we, at the moment, we kind of divide into different teams of people who want to focus on different things. So some people very much focus on the kind of campaign side of things. Other people focus on the growth side, because it is really important that we bring people in, and we get new members every month joining, and we want to make sure that everyone kind of has an understanding of what we do as an organisation, as a movement, and an understanding of our strategy when they join. So we have orientations on a regular basis for people to understand all that. So there are teams who work on that specifically. There are people who do more kind of public-facing communications, so like the webinars that you were talking about, Belinda, which, yeah, I forgot to mention, were another response we've had to COVID, which have been really interesting. And I'm trying to think of what other angles those are kind of the main teams, I would say. There's also kind of focusing on the community side of things, kind of building our community internally. But we do a lot of organisation online. We did do a fair amount kind of in person before COVID, and that was still when kind of definitely the vast majority of people, aside from me, were based in London. So we'd have face-to-face meetings, usually at least once a month, to talk about various aspects. But it was always very kind of focused on. We didn't want to be just meeting for meeting's sake. It was always an endeavour to, plan actions or something. But part of kind of that hybrid structure I was talking about before is that the idea is that you don't necessarily have a very clear hierarchical structure and very clear roles. That actually, as long as people are working towards this shared goal, you can be very flexible and reactive, and people can form new teams if they need to. And basically any small group of people can take the initiative to do a piece of work. And we're still kind of small enough at the moment to mostly all talk to each other and run things by each other. But as we grow, the idea is that people will take initiative more and more by themselves. We'll have different chapters all over the country in different Jewish communities. And that actually, that's how you bring about this kind of mass response. I forgot to mention another organization that kind of adopts this model is the Black Lives Matter movement, who, when that first started around 2012, 13, 14, there were a lot of chapters all over America. They would each do their own thing in their own towns according to what the response was needed, particularly in relation to police forces and what they were doing there. And that over time, over the past 7 years or so, that's led to this groundswell, which has now made it this kind of national movement and this mainstream understanding that Black lives do matter. There needs to be reform or transformation of the police force. So we want to have, on a much smaller scale, the British Jewish community, especially compared to the American community, is still very small. We all know each other basically. So on a much smaller scale, but we do want to have that effect where there's kind of a lot of spontaneity and people responding to what's around them in their own communities. And in terms of the makeup of our movement, it's not exclusively young people. We do have people of all ages. And yeah, that's another part of the diversity that I talked about. Just like we have religious plurality and political plurality to some extent. Obviously, people do need to oppose what's happening in Israel-Palestine. But I think by virtue of the fact that a lot of the people who started out were younger people who'd come through youth movements, just naturally kind of by snowballing, the people who came in first were the people that we knew and so on and so forth. But also I think it's about the position that we take and the language that we use, and very much, again, it being very rooted in the Jewish education that we received, and particularly those people who came through youth movements, about embracing Jewish values. These are all things, and also about not taking like very explicit positions on Israel, Palestine, and saying either you have to support a two-state solution or you don't. It brings in, people really, particularly people who are kind of grappling with these issues and grappling with their relationship to Israel. What we're saying resonates with them, so that's why they want to join. So I think it's about, in creating something that we knew that we wanted, we also recognize, a lot of other people felt the same way, and so that's why they kind of felt called to join, essentially. I was going to say something else there, but I can't remember what it was. Sorry,
okay,
I'll come back to
just on that, John Goodman has commented that he made a donation to NAMOD in July because he's impressed with you. He had a thank you email, but there wasn't any attempt to recruit him into membership.
Oh, Well, thank you very much for the donation. That is genuinely appreciated because they're all volunteers. We don't have a lot of funding, so it really does make a big impact. In terms of recruiting people into membership, I can't speak for that specific email, but we do definitely put out a lot of content on our website. I think when you land on our website, there's a button about joining. We make it very clear that we're looking for British Jews to join, because our power, we only have the power to transform our communities speaking as British Jews. I remember what I wanted to say before, which I think is there's some really interesting, it's interesting to explore what's happened in different generations in the Jewish community around Israel-Palestine. And I think the kind of earlier generations, the people who spoke out about Palestine, I think were often very ostracized from the community and made to feel like they weren't welcome. Maybe not just because of their views on Palestine, maybe because of their views on other things as well, because we have progressive views as a package. But essentially people were kind of forced out, I think, in a lot of cases, or made to feel like they weren't welcome or felt like they had to choose to leave. And actually, in some ways, these people were kind of the pioneers. You know, it took people before us speaking out and creating the space for us to speak out now. But I think what's happening now, which is different, is that young Jews who are progressive and who see what's happening in Israel-Palestine as wrong, they're not prepared to be forced out of the Jewish community anymore. And they're saying very much that actually, you know, we want to hold these values, we want to hold them as Jews, and we want to hold them within the Jewish community. And so that's what's been really transformative over the past few years, and I think is why what we're doing is quite different and impactful in a different way.
Just on that point, I mean, I'll just stay with NAMOD things, and then there's some broader questions which John Kelly's going to put. But you've emphasised the working with progressive Jews, and Andy Smith is saying he recalled hearing an interview with the Stamford Hill Orthodox Jew around the time of attempts to discredit Corbyn, and they were basically saying that the Board of Deputies didn't represent them. They knew Corbyn as a local MP, and they knew he was anti-racist. So we're just wondering how are you getting much interest, much reach into the Orthodox Jewish community?
No, so actually I spent a large part of my childhood not as an Orthodox Jew, but living in that community, so I have some knowledge of it. No, so the ultra-Orthodox community, the ones who live in Stamford Hill and also in some other parts of the country, particularly Gateshead in the north east, they are totally separate to the rest of the Jewish community. They don't engage with it at all. So yeah, they don't, or a very small number send representatives to the Board of Deputies, but no, by and large they don't. They're also, for a large part, they would say that they're non-Zionist for religious reasons more than political ones. So yeah, they don't engage with the wider Jewish community, and so basically, yeah, we have no significant relationship with them because they also don't really engage on the issue of Israel-Palestine at all. The odd person might speak out, like, you know, there's always individuals who do that in any community. But yeah, they don't really organize in the Jewish community, so there's no input from them really on outreach to them. If someone wanted to join us, we'd totally welcome them. But also the other thing to remember about the ultra-Orthodox community, if people are practicing, is they often, for example, it's quite a patriarchal community. They don't engage with, you know, men and women don't interact. They don't often recognize women in positions of leadership. And also, you know, so that would be incompatible with our values. And also, you know, we have, for example, women rabbis who are members of NAMOD and who are involved in founding NAMOD. And the ultra-Orthodox community, they don't even recognize the denominations of Judaism for by and large. We would appoint women rabbis. So yeah, for all sorts of reasons, there isn't much engagement with them as things stand.
John, would you like to, John Kelly, do you want to unmute yourself? And then I think you've got a couple of questions.
Yeah, the first one was, do you think it's right that British Jews should be able to join the IDF and be part of the occupation army? when, for example, people who went to fight for the Kurds against ISIS were considered to be criminal and were arrested when they came back?
It's an interesting and difficult question. So do I think it's right? I don't think, I would personally say to any British Jew that I don't think they should join the IDF, because the IDF is heavily involved, or it's crucial to upholding the occupation. I think the occupation is morally indefensible, and so I don't think anyone should go and play a part in that. But I also wouldn't say that I think British Jews should be banned from doing it. I think the issue around people fighting for the Kurds is a separate issue. I don't think one situation justifies the other. I think I'm speaking, this is why I said at the beginning that I'm speaking in a personal capacity, because different people in our mod will take different views to me. But I think I and others in our mod would say that actually it's important, even though you want to take a morally clear line on the issue of occupation, we know from our own experience that it's important to empathize with how British Jews feel about Israel. And I touched on it at the very start of my slides around, we're raised to have a really close connection to Israel. I definitely, I still in many ways see Israel as a part of my Jewish identity. Most British Jews do. And we're taught very much to believe, and people still in our mod still believe that Israel as a state is, not everyone in our mod, some people, that it's essential to our safety as Jews, that we do need a state of our own, because there's a risk to us otherwise. And I think it's important to have empathy for how Jews around the world feel around that, even if you don't agree with it. And so I think unilaterally, I do understand very much from a Palestinian perspective. It's one of these things you grapple with. I do very much understand from a Palestinian perspective why it would be outrageous to think that a British Jew would go and join the IDF or involved in the oppression of Palestinians. But looking from my perspective, around wanting to transform my community from a place of caring about it, I think saying unilaterally that British Jews can't join the IDF is the wrong approach. But I personally would try and persuade them not to if I had that conversation with them.
Many of us who are active sort of on behalf of Palestinians and justice for the Palestinians feel that one of the problems is that there is no international pressure on Israel not to continue its steady and creeping annexation of the West Bank, and indeed, it's sort of continuing and serial breaches of international law. And would like to see, for example, our own government taking a stronger stance, and that because it sort of doesn't really take any stance of any strength. I mean, it declares a position but does nothing to put pressure on Israel to conform. So would Namod, do you think, support efforts to try and get the UK government to take action against the occupation, for example, by banning trade with settlements, or another suggestion has been removing visa-free travel to the UK from settlers on the basis that they are committing crimes, just by being settlers, if you like, and living on stolen land. And we don't normally let people who've got criminal records, known criminal records, come into the country. You see the logic of where I'm going.
Yeah. So it's a good question about our government. We're not a lobby group. We're very clear that our role is to transform the British Jewish community, not to lobby the government. And also, again, this comes back to some of the polarity we have around politics within our movement. But particularly around annexation, we did essentially take that line that, yes, absolutely, we do want there to be more international pressure. And so that's why one of the places that we went to with our action where we projected messages onto the buildings was the Foreign Office. And that was actually the one that got the most kind of attention. And we said that, it's wrong for the government to just kind of issue milquetoast statements about supporting peace and not take any action to support that. So, and we also expressed some support for the position essentially that Labour took around that there needed to be an embargo on settlement produce, on imports to the UK, because yes, it's absolutely not right that that the occupation is allowed to continue, and there's no impunity for the Israeli government around that. I think banning settlers from coming in, I think that's a really complicated example. There are definitely settlers who are overtly criminal and who enact a lot of violence against Palestinians, and yes, absolutely all the land is stolen. But also, going back to that pillar of support example, like the Israeli government has constructed current Israeli society and economy and politics around upholding the occupation. So often the people, not often, some of the people who are living in settlements are not victims in the same way as Palestinians, but they're also people with very little power in society. And they are, for example, they might be living in a lot of poverty. And so they're economically incentivized to move to settlements by the Israeli government, who want to kind of maintain that presence in the occupied territories. So I think, again, taking this blanket view that all settlers are criminals and should be banned from coming into the UK, I think is the wrong approach. I think we need to definitely, when there are criminal acts, hold people accountable around that. But we also need to view the occupation as part of many structures of oppression, and we need to dismantle all of them to end the occupation. So also, it's about the liberation of Jews and Palestinians in Israel. And obviously the Palestinians are the most vulnerable people, and they deserve definitely the bulk of the attention. But you need to take a much broader approach to bring about true kind of equality and justice for everyone.
Okay, I think John wasn't necessarily suggesting that settlers are banned, but there should be a visa requirement on them in the same way there is for Palestinians. But are there any other questions? I'm getting messages saying that my internet connection is stable, so I'm going to pass the floor back to Sally. I don't know, does anybody else have questions? Please indicate. You're all frozen to me now, so I can't see what reactions there are. I'm sure I'll get full service back soon, but I'll pass back to Sally.
Okay, perhaps if people have got questions, they just raise their hand and then we can unmute you and you can ask your own question. Sorry about that, Belinda. Can you hear us? All right, yes. Any questions? Michael, is that a question? Michael Luck? You need to unmute yourself, Michael. No, it's not a question.
Andy, you want to speak?
Oh, Andy, unmute yourself and ask a question.
Thanks, Sally. Yeah, I mean, feel free to ignore this, Thomas, because it's a bit personal, really. But I'm aware that some of our Jewish members in Justice for Palestinians have been, let's say, that their families aren't best pleased that they've suddenly started, flying the Palestinian flag, as it were, and it's caused a little bit of grief for some of them in wider family gatherings. You don't need to answer this as personally for you, but is it something that, how are NAMOD activists coping with that, or are they all from families that they've managed to persuade to man the barricades as well?
It's a huge mix. So some people were very much raised in families where people were very conscious of these issues. Other people have been on a journey, but their families have been on kind of the same journey with them, or maybe one step behind them. And so, their kind of views have changed, and they're still accepted by their families. Other people, there is a gap with what they believe and their families believe, but it's not too much of an issue. I'm not personally aware of anyone in NAMOD who's been kind of totally ostracized in their families, but particularly some of the people who not exclusively come from more more conservative, both religiously and politically, households. I'm sure, you know, there's difficulty, and also the other thing is that a lot of British Jews have family in Israel who find it difficult to kind of understand what why they're doing this work. So there's a whole range, and definitely it is difficult for some people, and you know, I don't necessarily see eye to eye with my family and everything, but I'm very fortunate in that that hasn't been a huge issue for me, at least not, I haven't done anything alienation yet. And definitely for other people, it has been more of an issue, and it's taken immense courage for them to do this sort of activism. And I think it just goes to show, like, you know, how complicated this issue is in the Jewish community, and how, as you touch on, how difficult it can be for people to speak out. And it's difficult to kind of, because a lot of us in particular, if we've been on a journey, really understand where people are coming from in the community when they defend Israel uncritically. It's a challenge, but one that we have to kind of live up to hold that empathy, and at the same time kind of have an uncompromising position where we won't accept racism towards Palestinians, and we won't accept justifications for you know, the Israeli government systemically violating their human rights. But I think that is the right approach, which is ultimately going to bring about change. So it's just a tightrope that we need to walk.
Thank you. Yeah.
I think it's...
Is there an equivalent of NAMOD in other parts of Europe, other countries in Europe?
In Europe, I don't think so. I might be wrong, but as far as I'm aware, there's not an equivalent of us. I think actually, on the whole, probably the British Jewish community is slightly more progressive on the whole compared to most European Jewish communities, or most of the larger ones anyway. I think in some other European countries, you would get equivalent of very small Jewish organizations or groups of Jews who are anti-Zionist. And then you might get some who are kind of more liberal Zionist. I think there's a New Israel Fund, which is a liberal Zionist organization in Germany or Switzerland maybe. But there isn't, as far as I'm aware, there isn't anything quite like us, who are kind of using a direct action approach, and who are more kind of an umbrella group for a range of different views on Israel, just focusing on the occupation. Yeah, there definitely is in America and in Israel, but not in Europe, as far as I'm aware right now.
Just relating to the question of you know, people having trouble with their families, whatever. I think it's interesting for us, because I mean, speaking on behalf of myself and Bernard, and I think probably of the other Jews in Leamington who are involved, we are rather adrift from the Jewish community. I mean, we feel very strongly as Jews, and we have a historical and philosophical attachment to the Jewish community, but we're not terribly involved with the Jewish community as such. Now, it sounds as if you are talking as if the majority of people that you're dealing with are still very involved with the Jewish community. Is that correct?
So there is a range. There are people who have never had much involvement and who still aren't involved. But there are a lot of people who, yes, are involved. I mean, we have people, if you understand how, like, the Board of Deputies works, it's essentially kind of like a parliament of Jewish organizations. We have people in NAMOD who are deputies on the Board of Deputies. We have people who are leaders in youth movements. So yeah, definitely compared to a lot of people who've come before us, a lot of people are quite involved in the Jewish community in different ways, and we think that's important. But also, we're also very clear that it's not membership isn't dependent on that, because it doesn't matter whether you're involved in the Jewish community or not, or if you're secular or if you're religious. the Israeli government is still perpetuating the occupation in the name of you as a Jew. And so that's why we think it's important to speak out as Jews. But yeah, we're very all-encompassing. But I think the difference is that more than before, we have members who are active in Jewish community organizations. And like I said before, you know, we have people who are rabbis who are, if not members, who are supporters. And that's, you know, a fairly novel thing for this sort of activism. So I think that's kind of what's different.
Sally, can I ask
Yeah, John, please do. Yeah.
Sometimes I feel that the government and political parties spend far too much time listening to the Board of Deputies and trying to win favour with the Board of Deputies, and not enough time listening to organisations like yours and Jews for Justice for Palestinians and Yakad. How do you feel about that?
It's really, it's complicated. So I agree with the Board of Deputies on, I won't put a percentage on it, but a lot, at least half of everything they do, probably. I disagree with them, and particularly on Israel-Palestine, I think that their position is unjustifiable. And yeah, I think it's unjustifiable morally, but also I think, you know, they are actually speaking for a minority of the community on Israel-Palestine, and that's, yeah, so they're not even being democratic about it. But I think at the same time, you can't listen to, you can't pick and choose who you listen to, essentially. You have to listen to, if you're going to listen to Jews, you have to listen to everyone and try and make sense of all the different opinions that are out there. The Board of Deputies on a lot of issues, they do speak for a lot of British Jews. And at Naamad, we're not pretending that we hold more authority than the Board of Deputies. We don't speak for more people than they do. It's not like we're representative and they're not. But it's just that we do speak for a lot of people who aren't currently represented when it comes to Israel-Palestine by communal figureheads like the Board of Deputies or the Jewish Leadership Council. So I think there are people who would rather that people outside the Jewish community didn't listen to the Board of Deputies at all. I don't think that's right. The Board of Deputies, they're not a completely hard right or far right organization as some people would like to make them out to be. They do speak for a lot of British Jews, and on some issues, you know, most people in Naamad would definitely agree with them. Like, they're doing a lot of work now around racism within the Jewish community, which we're broadly supportive of. And they do all sorts of work on like non-political issues around religious freedom, which is also important, and kind of interfaith work as well. But I think it's important to acknowledge that, yeah, just as it's important to listen to minority Jewish voices in the Jewish community who may hold opinions which are out of step with the mainstream view, you can't only listen to them. You know, the Board of Deputies need to be listened to as well. Yeah, does that answer your question? It's not very equivocal, sorry. Well, I think you've muted yourself. So.
I believe John Goodman has a question. We may make this the last, unless anybody's got a burning question afterwards. So, John Goodman, do you want to go ahead?
All right. Oh, you're not speaking for us today. So I read. My question is, I'll just read what I wrote. This is a kind of a intergenerational question, I suppose. Some of my older Jewish family friends who are socialists cling to the idea of Zionism as a socialist project. I find it hard to shift them from this position, and I wondered if you had any comments or suggestions beyond arguing that whatever it might once have been, modern Zionism has lost or possibly abandoned all connection it might once have had with socialism.
Well, I wouldn't give a clear argument around trying to persuade them, because like I said, NAMOD is a movement inclusive of both progressive Zionists and non-Zionists or anti-Zionists. So essentially our view is that it doesn't necessarily matter. It's like what you do. If you're a liberal Zionist and on paper and you're defending Israel every opportunity, then that's obviously not okay. But you can be a liberal Zionist and strongly criticize the occupation and what's going on in Israel. And I think that's a far better position to take. I do think when it comes to socialist Zionism, yes, that's been a big part of kind of left-wing Jewish identity for many decades, since the foundation of Israel and before it. And it's hard to see how that even exists anymore, never mind any hope for it. I mean, the left has been out of power for years in Israel, and it's entirely diminished as a political force. Israel's in a pretty dire state, both with the occupation and beyond it. It's far from a socialist country. I think it's important that people, no matter what labels they give themselves or what kind of ideals they hold, I just think it's important to acknowledge the reality of what's happening there and to specifically focus on opposing that. Like at the moment, Palestinians have been living under occupation for half a century. It's de facto annexation. The conditions in Gaza are practically unspeakable. And so whatever label or political position you identify with, I think it's important that people speak out against that. But from a specifically kind of left-wing perspective, there's been a talk for a few years now, and it's gaining momentum all the time, around looking at how Jewish-Arab solidarity within Israel, so left-wing Jews and left-wing Palestinian citizens of Israel, how that's very much kind of the future of a political force. And while in the old days, decades ago, it was left-wing Jews who held most political power in Israel, now left-wing Jews are never going to get any sort of significant power unless they join forces with Palestinian citizens of Israel. And so that's very much the approach that the Joint List has taken, the political party in Israel, which is led by Ayman Odeh, who's a really kind of inspirational figure, a Palestinian citizen of Israel, but who works with Jews. And it's what movements like Standing Together, which is a Jewish-Arab joint solidarity movement, which is kind of led by Jews and Arabs together, and a kind of grassroots movement, who also draw on a lot of the same kind of organizational theory of change that we use in NAMOD, and have grown a lot in recent years. So I think examples like that, I mean, that's really the future of a progressive force in Israel. So I would encourage people to kind of explore that, and that also unequivocally has to be anti-occupation.
Okay, I'm going to give Miranda the chance to make the last comment question, and then we'll come back to you. So thank you, Thomas. Miranda?
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm just going back to the point you made about the Board of Deputies. You were saying that obviously, as they represent quite a few Jews in this country, they should be listened to, but they actually explicitly asked all of the candidates of the Labour Party leadership to sign up to 10 commitments. And one of those commitments was not to listen to Jews that they considered were not mainstream. Now, I'm a sort of associate member of your organization and Jews for Justice and things. I felt that basically it was saying that you should only listen to us and not the likes of your organization, Jews for Justice. And in fact, they only represent about a quarter of the Jews in the UK. And they were actually asking that the candidates ignore the views of many other Jews. Just final comment on that, please.
Yeah, I think I would say my observation is the issue is that particularly non-Jews, but not only, but particularly non-Jews, everyone was just it was like picking their fighter in the fight around anti-Semitism. So some people would like pick the Board of Deputies or the Campaign Against Anti-Semitism or whoever, and other people would pick Jewish Voice for Labour or the Jewish Socialist Group or whatever, and everyone would just like pick it was like football, you pick your team and stand behind them no matter what and just ignore what everyone else was saying. And actually, I think that that's so unhelpful in so many different ways, and actually it doesn't really help us tackle anti-Semitism or racism or any other sort of oppression in society at all. I think, you know, with the 10 pledges, like, I think, you know, there are some of them which I would agree with, some which I don't. I think that overall it's probably been overblown. Like, I don't think it's as big a deal as people, a lot of people make it out to be. But yes, I think it's wrong for the Board of Deputies to say people shouldn't listen to minority Jewish voices. You know, definitely as a minority Jewish voice, I don't support that. But equally, like the people who are outraged by that, they also need to acknowledge that it's wrong to ignore entirely what organisations like the Board of Deputies were saying, because, you know, they did speak for many Jews, even some of those who they didn't represent. So I think, you know, there are people who would criticise that position by the Board of Deputies on the basis that they think that, you know, anti-Semitism on the left was like a complete concoction to undermine Corbyn. And I think that it's important to, at the very least, empathise with the Jews who felt scared, even if it's unjustified for various reasons.
I think the problem is we hear what the Board of Deputies say loudly and clearly on all mainstream media. Because of the attitude of the Board of Deputies, we do not hear on an unbiased way the views of other Jews. And I think that is shocking.
I think like there have been a variety of views that have been heard in the media. I've definitely heard them in the media. And I think, again, it just comes back to this tribalism. And I think really there just needs to be a lot more empathy on all sides and kind of acknowledging different views that are out there.
I think we're going to have to end that there. I think what Miranda is reflecting is how the Jewish Board of Deputies does put themselves forward as if they represent all Jews. And that's the thing that I think annoys and distresses most of us who don't feel that they do. But anyway, Tommy, thanks very much. It's been interesting to hear about Nahmod and how clearly they've thought out what they stand for and what they intend to do. And very interesting to hear about your journey from when we first met you and you came back and from where you are now. So very best of wishes to Nahmod. I'm sure we'll all go on their website now and have a good look. And thank you everybody for joining us. And don't forget our next vigil against the occupation on September 12th, I think.
Yes,
is this the 12th? It's nodded ahead. This is the 12th. Okay. Thank you very much. And
thank
good night,
you very
everybody.
much for having me.
All right.
Thank you, Tom. It's been great.
I'm glad. Thank you.
Cheers, everybody.
Cheerio, Thomas.
Bye.
Best of luck.
Thank you very much.
Very interesting talk.
I'm glad you thought so. Thank you.
Very clearly put. Cheers.